Hello, listeners, and welcome to Season 7, Episode 2 of Solarpunk Presents, in which Ariel and I explore science fiction's explorations of Utopia. Before we dive in, let me remind you that we need your support, so be sure to join our Patreon, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click like. Last season, we ended up talking about the stories The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin and The Ones Who Stay and Fight by N.K. Jemisin, and I had some questions.
And concerns.
So let's talk about utopias. For starters, where does the idea come from?
The first instance of a utopia, named Utopia, was a small novel written by an Englishman named Sir Thomas More in 1516. And
I believe that must be the most understated description of Sir and Saint Thomas More, like literally ever. Renaissance humanist, writer, lawyer, judge, and Lord High Chancellor to Henry VIII. He went down in history as the man who was executed for standing up against the Protestant Reformation and Henry VIII appointing himself head of the Church of England. They literally chopped his head off for his refusal to put the King of England above the Pope. We should also say that he was an enthusiastic proponent of burning heretics, such as Protestants, at the stake, which he was in the position to encourage as Lord Chancellor.
hey, trying to pick apart texts we love from their super problematic authors is like a feminist sci-fi fan's main occupation. So I think we're used to that by now. And I mean, he clearly has ideas about how things should be run. Utopia was in the style of a travelogue or a story of a journey to a new land, which were very popular at the time. So think Gulliver's Travels for another example in this genre.
Another classic that I have never read. But still, I could see how that could be an effective way to describe an imaginary place. On some level, like the Lord of the Rings books are also just a big travelogue.
Yeah, Tolkien's original frame narrative was of a traveler scholar who translated this historical text from Westron into English so that we could read it. So kind of like what we do with Norse sagas now, and so we can kind of understand what the world used to be like.
Oh my God, have you read them? They're like soap operas.
Yep, yeah. Yes. They're great.
You like soap
Okay,
operas.
sorry. Back to Utopia. So it's important to remember that it was a political satire that was aimed very specifically at the government of England at the time. So the book itself makes no bones about the society of Utopia being made up, as you is no and topia is place in Greek. So the title was basically like fake place.
The next time I see a no U-turn sign, I'm going to be like extra confused. But I think I'm already starting to get the gist of the answer to the question, why the hell does everyone think Utopia would be hell?
It's right there in Ursula Le Guin's Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, right? Like she says, happiness is boring. It's the treason of the artist and all that. That, like misery is just fundamentally more interesting than happiness. Got to make things exciting with it, I guess, or like danger or threats or whatever. You've got to work that into your story. A lot of later science fiction utopias follow the model of the original Utopia in describing a place that doesn't exist in order to critique contemporary society or political order. So, like Omelas, or that one movie where like rich folk live in a beautiful floating city and gross poor people live on the face of the planet where everything is violent and like dirty.
Well, it's not quite what I'm getting at. They don't mean that happiness is boring. They mean that Utopia is authoritarian and that its citizens are numb little lambs who need the firm hand of the nanny state to take care of them because they have no idea what's best for themselves. Kind of like the people in N.K. Jemisin's retort to the Amelas story. Also kind of like the wee hobbits living in the blissfully simple, cozy, happy Shire. By the way, you're thinking of the Matt Damon and Jodie Foster film Elysium, which is just another let's uphold the patriarchy male hero fantasy movie where the guy who gets to be the hero who saves the female plot devices, in this case, the pretty young mother and her child dying of leukemia, while, oops, accidentally saving the world at the same time from the evil bastards known as power-hungry, greedy, heartless rich people.
Okay, well, maybe the answer for your question, maybe it's What you're looking for can be found in the original Utopia book as described by Thomas More. So, the original Utopia described a small island country with 54 cities, but mainly a rural agricultural landscape. So, a lot of the tropes of Utopia are in there. There's no private property, for instance.
Oh, so like there's a big storehouse somewhere that people can go to and ask for what they need. I bet there's no locks on doors either. But how is housing allocated if no one gets to have anything of their own?
They solve that by mandating that once every 10 years, people have to move house as the population is cycled through the entire stock of housing.
Well, I guess that's one way to deal with hoarding problems as well. What about occupations? How do they handle that?
Okay, so that's both communal and individual. Like everybody, men and women, have to learn how to farm and do it for like 2 years. But they also have to learn and practice at least one other occupation, like weaving or metalsmithing or carpentry or masonry.
Oh, that's all very practical. And now let me guess. Everybody has to wear the same drab clothes as everyone else.
Yeah, there's no fancy fashion or self-expression through clothing in Utopia.
So you can't dress like all the other different people. You have to dress like all the other ordinary people.
I mean, there's also no unemployment, so I guess people aren't like too unhappy with the state of things.
Okay, so how do they manage to have no unemployment?
Everyone is obligated to work, but the bright side is that because everybody is pitching in to get done what needs getting done, the workday is actually really short.
Yeah, my spouse grew up in East Germany and there was no unemployment there either. I mean, it's not actually that workable a model.
Yeah,
um,
I mean, yeah, this is all in the imagination, right?
okay.
In addition to that, there's also slavery.
Wait, what?
Personal wealth is really frowned upon. So while there's communal wealth in the form of gold, it's also used to make objects like chamber pots. So people don't become too enamored of gold because they're literally pooping on it every day.
Yeah, that is crazy. Do you know how much gold is worth these days? A chamber pot, if it was pure gold, would cost like $100,000.
Anyway, why hoard gold when what you get in exchange for being a citizen of the utopian society is access to free hospitals, communal meals eaten in dining halls, and the right to euthanasia and, radical for those times, divorce? Although, on the other hand, premarital sex and adultery are extremely severely punished.
Wait, no, wait. So this Moore guy was a Catholic. I mean, he was so Catholic he got sainted. And so that bit about divorce can't be what he actually believed was good.
I mean, yeah, he also wasn't big on religious freedom, obviously, if he was roasting heretics in his off time from writing. But Utopia does actually have religious freedom as well. You can choose what to believe.
Although,
It isn't a fan of atheists. People are strongly encouraged to choose a religion, no matter how strange their faith may be.
how do women fare in this utopia?
I mean, about as well as you could expect. Like, men still rule the roost with women being subservient.
Well, that kind of figures. Can you tell me an upside of this utopia?
Well, no one's
You're,
waging wars in Utopia, like it's a completely peaceful society, but no one has any right to privacy either.
this is a complicated issue. So, like today in Europe, privacy is a big deal, and yet, oh, it's still a little bit like that in parts of continental Europe.
Hmm.
Like, although I don't think they're anywhere as bad as the Dutch, Germans don't do curtains. Kind of because if everything you do is in full view of people and, I guess God, you're compelled to behave reasonably.
I mean, that does make a sort of sense, I guess. Anyways, because they didn't have a god to fear, that's why Utopia sort of officially actually despised atheists. Like they were an immoral danger to society because like, without God, how can you have a moral code, right?
I mean, without someone looking over your shoulder threatening you with eternal damnation, how would people ever behave themselves? That's a very dark view of human beings. On the other hand, the last couple of links, I'm like, maybe that's not so out of line.
I mean, if you think about the time that Thomas More was living in and all of the like religious like drama that was happening with like burning people and chopping people's heads off and stuff like that, I don't blame him for having a bit of a dim view of humanity at the time.
Wait,
Um,
he was doing burning.
yeah, I
Or
know, because
okay.
otherwise he would get burned. or so goes the logic, right? You do
Well,
something
he
to
did
other
get his
people
head chopped
first.
off.
Well, yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Oh, I'm so confused by all of this. I mean, some of what you say about this, I'm not going to call it utopia, but anyways, this
Mhm.
first utopia that was called the Utopia. Some of it
This
sounds great,
literary utopia. Yeah.
and some of it sounds awful. I also can't see how a staunch Catholic who burned Protestants and other heretics at the stake, and so was so deeply um, had such conviction in his beliefs that he was willing to die for them. I just can't see how he was proposing that all these things in his utopia that you just told me, he can't have thought they were all good ideas. I mean, he can't have thought they were all bad ideas either. So, I mean, the water is very muddy here.
That also has to do with the, fictional convention that the story was written in. So, the effect of a lot of travel narratives at the time was to compare and contrast the new society that the traveler encountered with their home society, right? So, More's frame narrative was that the society of Utopia was explained not by him, but by his acquaintance, Raphael Hythlodaeus, who is the actual a fictional guy who traveled to the island in the first place, and he has different opinions than Moore. So Sir Tom complains about politics to his friend, and Raphael tells him about how the Utopians solve the problems that Moore is detailing. This all happens over a series of letters back and forth. So technically, Utopia isn't actually presented by Sir Thomas More, but by this character, Raphael Hythlodaeus, who, like most fictional characters, has opinions and values that differ from those of the author.
I'm sorry, did you just call him Sir Tom?
Yes, I did.
That's worse than chopping his head off. Um, I'm still hung up on the slavery bit. Why spoil a perfectly pleasant utopian existence by having an underclass?
My assumption was that at the time, a lot of societies in Europe and beyond had slaves. And since slavery had been a part of day-to-day life in the Roman Empire and the ancient Greek world, which wider European society at the time, especially due to the Renaissance, thought was like just the best thing ever, was included because of that.
Right, right. The Renaissance was in the 1400s and 1500s, more or less. And it was kind of about standing on the foundation of classical antiquity and moving forward from there. And you had this blossoming of humanist ideas that put humanity and the nature of humanity at the center of everything, while still maintaining a Christian outlook. But yeah, I guess slavery had been a pretty normal thing for centuries in a lot of European countries. That's funny. They didn't teach us that when we were taking Western Civ. But anyways, and it wasn't just African slaves like we think of today when we talk about slavery, but people from the Middle East and even Europeans who had been captured in war or sold into slavery by relatives or what have you. So I guess that does put this utopia smack dab into the middle of that confusing pot of cultural influences.
Okay, so we get sort of the underclass or slaves point of view of Utopia in like more modern sci-fi stories. So the big example right now would be the Hunger Games, where the capital is the Utopia, but it's really obvious how shitty it is for a ton of people to live in a state of misery, propping up a tiny upper class. Also, just going back to Tolkien for a moment, I have to point out that the Hobbit's Shire is a pretty blatant reference to West England, which of course was only so idyllic because the wealth of empire allowed the landed gentry to retreat to their countryside in the early 20th century. The Shire is untouched by the workings of the wider world because, unbeknownst to them, the Rangers, aka descendants of Númenóreans, are protecting them. They're the nannies of the nanny state. So, yeah, their happiness is contingent on a sheeply existence.
As you say, tropes. I'm beginning to understand why all of these utopias you mentioned, including Amala's, predicate the existence of utopia on some sort of slavery or oppression. It goes straight back to the beginning of the writings on Utopia by Sir Thomas More. But that doesn't mean I get why it has to be like this. Why doesn't anyone believe that we could create a prosperous society that doesn't take advantage of other people? This reeks rather unimaginatively of, as you say, empire and colonialism, wherein lands that prospered did so because of all the resources, wealth, and labor they were sucking out of their colonies. But surely it is possible for everyone to prosper at the same time. Life does not need to be a zero sum game, and neither does economics. Or am I being the one who is naive? I mean, or maybe not even just me. After all, Solarpunk dreams of utopian-like futures where we're all in it together and living great lives.
The original Utopia was a slavery society, so uncritical copying of that trope might be partially responsible, like literarily speaking, for this whole sort of legacy of Utopia relies on an underclass. But yeah, there seems to be an inherent assumption that in a utopian situation, there are the people on top living the high life and the powerless people suffering on the bottom, which is where dystopias come in. They're just descriptions of the same utopia, but seen from the perspective of the oppressed. I mean, it kind of makes sense to me that there was a recent boom in a lot of YA science fictions about dystopia recently, since teenagers have a really crabby position where they're old enough to start understanding how the world works, but they're also completely powerless to do anything about it, as they're still marked as children in the family unit, they're forbidden from voting, they're only barely able to drive, so they can't really get themselves anywhere.
Honestly, I mean, we're kind of all feeling powerless to do anything about it right now.
Yeah.
I'll give you that a lot of this YA fiction is about teenagers who overthrow adult power structures and set the world to right because those stupid adults. But also, as a teenager, yeah, you're waking up to the fact that people can be awful, but it's kind of fascinating. I mean, a lot of YA novels are incredibly perverse and violent. There's so much twisted territory here to explore. But also, a lot of people never outgrow their fantasies of being part of the heroic and righteous rebellion against the immoral, repressive forces in this world. Everybody identifies with the underdogs fighting for freedom from the greedy, capitalist, militaristic, authoritarian regime. Even the real life cartoon villains who've toppled democracy and set up the greedy, capitalist, militaristic, authoritarian surveillance state regime where even 95-year-old ladies are going to be forced to make and receive government payments in the goddamn richest man in the world's personal cryptocurrency. Sorry, I could go on
Well,
like this for days.
I hope that particular prediction does not come true because, wow. But hauling us back on track, everyone tends to think that they're the hero of their own story, even the villains. And that's the tragedy of it, I guess. It's like trying to force your story over someone else's. That's the problem. But in my view, the fact that teens are intellectually capable of understanding much more about the world, but are disempowered to do anything about it, like legally, makes them great protagonists for dystopian novels that are focused on the miserable underclass that props up the utopia. The catharsis of bringing down an unjust system is pretty real, and never mind the consequences or aftermath. So growing up and critically thinking about your convictions can sometimes lead to some shocking realizations and disheartening truths. So, that's why a lot of YA novels just kind of stop there.
But there is plenty of room right now for fantasizing about bringing down an unjust regime. There is something about the unfairness of everything they're doing that makes you wish death to rain down upon certain horrible characters before they can do any more damage to people and democratic institutions. Even if you yourself are generally a mild, helpful person sickened by violence.
There is a teenager who is boiling inside each of our souls.
I don't know, but what feels boiling right now feels more like a decent adult human being being outraged by injustice and the lack of state action against the purveyors of it. Also, it's just horrible seeing horrible people getting away with horrible things. And it's just.
Yep.
But to get back to utopias, a lot of them are portrayed so negatively, even when they don't involve an underclass. I remember reading The Dispossessed a couple years ago and thinking the utopia was just as awful as the not utopia in that book. No one gets to be an individual. And I have to confess, I like the idea of owning things. And I don't think that makes me a jerk. I think saying no one can own things is just too extreme a solution to the problem of wealth and power inequality. It's unreasonable to expect of people. I mean, never mind loving shopping and loving to create things. We all have favorite things and our own tastes and style. Right. So I'm also already iffy on the idea of no one being able to own property, like to have a place they can call their own and fashion to their own taste, needs, and desires. But I'm open to changing my mind about that one. But if you tell me I'm not allowed to have clothing, jewelry, photos, computers, a camera, a musical instrument, or other objects that have enormous personal, useful, or sentimental value to me. I mean, I do not want to live in your utopia.
That's a sticky subject, yeah. Like, I hate a mandate against that too, but maybe once I'm living in a utopia, I wouldn't attach as much value to the things in my life and be very like zen about personal property, so it wouldn't bother me, especially if I was raised in that society and it was all I had ever known. So, but who knows?
Yeah, I have to go away and think about this one because I do have to admit, I just had to rapidly clean out my mother's house, and I'm shocked by how few of the things there I kept. I mean, some of that it was just because it wasn't practical to haul stuff overseas. But some of that was just that aside from some kitchen utensils I remember fondly from my childhood, so I hung on to them, mostly what turned out to be important to me was photos. One of which was a photo of my dad and his sister, his mom, and his uncles, who were somewhat freshly home from the war, sitting on their sofa next to their fake Christmas tree on Christmas Eve, 1946, in Lincoln Heights, Los Angeles. Unseen because she must have been taking the picture is my dad's maternal grandmother. And when I look at that photo, I think, holy cow, the only two items in that photo that still exist in anyone's possession are the still living bodies of my dad and aunt. Okay, they're a little bit taller now, but everything else, the clothes, the shoes, the tree, its sparse decorations, and its tinsel, the furniture, the curtains, the rug, and whatever was in the still wrapped presents, that's all long since landed in landfill. I don't even think the house itself is still standing. So, what was the point of all those belongings, aside from the service they provided for a while? But on the other hand, if belongings don't belong to anyone, what are we going to call them? Anyways, even though utopias are portrayed so negatively, either because of requiring an underclass, a lobotomy, a relinquishment of individuality, or all three, a lot of us still dream about them. I mean, isn't that exactly what Solarpunk is doing? Dreaming of utopian futures in hopes of manifesting them.
Yeah, and so here's where I get up on my soapbox, and I apologize in advance for the pontificating that I am about to do. But however, I personally think of utopia not as a place that we're ever going to get to, but as a beautiful dream that we should be striving for throughout our lives. I think, like, when you try to pin utopia down, it kills it. The same way that pinning a beautiful butterfly to a board kills it, or how some people assume that you have to kill a frog in order to see how it works. No wonder how marvelous you think the animal is while it still lives. Because every utopia is unique, trying to impose one person's utopia over top another person's free will is going to make it at the very least irritating, if not outright oppressive. I think that all solar punks can agree on a code of ethics or philosophy for life, to value and respect human and non-human life, to invest in technologies that make our lives better, to be kind to the planet and gracious to other people around us and all that. But if I said that in my utopia, everyone would have to have blue as their favorite color, that would ruffle some feathers. Trying to control the nitty-gritty is, to me, pretty silly.
Ah, well, I mean, legislating what people's favorite color should be is is ridiculous. But
Look, it was just an example I pulled out of the ether. But
okay,
you can imagine that, there might be more. So,
okay. So I'd like to think that solar punks could all get along and have mutual respect for one another, but I'm not convinced that even we solar punks manage it. But if I have followed your metaphor correctly, what you're saying is that utopia can only be an ideal. And when you try to figure out how it would work in practice, it falls apart because of human nature, because everyone can't have everything they want without trampling all over other people's wants, needs, rights, and boundaries. And so utopias in fiction quickly go authoritarian.
yeah, you got it. The older I get, the more comfortable I am about the fact that I think in abstractions. So I guess instead of dreaming about a utopian future, as in like a concrete political or social system or urban plan or agricultural scheme or whatever, I rather think that solar punks would be better served to focus on dreaming about futures that are full of utopian values and being okay with the different ways that those will manifest sort of across the globe. My thoughts on the issue that we keep circling about around, like why we can't imagine a utopia without a dystopia. Well, I'm resisting the Calvinist knee-jerk response that it's because we all are born sinful and that being irritating is just part of the human condition. But to be serious, I think it's because of focusing on concrete structures and trying to imagine future social conditions, like down to the letter. I think it's actually a pretty useless exercise because nobody can predict the future, much less trends in architecture and fashion. I'm not saying they can't be influenced, by the way, but there's no telling how it will turn out, and trying to force a certain outcome might end up making some people pretty unhappy. And so that's why I think a lot of the best Solarpunk stories are vague on the details and are much better when they focus on characters, their motivations, and their relationships. The Utopia is a backdrop, and the character doesn't know how everything works. And those stories are usually short and sweet. The longer they are, the more time that I have to pull critical holes in the scenario.
Yeah, you don't want readers missing the point of what you're trying to say with your story because they're all, I would hate to live in this place. This is so not my idea of utopia. Also, a hard science fiction treatise on the inner workings of a utopian society. Oh, yawn.
You got me.
Sorry.
I think that's something we talked about previously in the episode about post-apocalypses. Like, focusing on details to me makes a story worse and not better. So part of why I really enjoy Ursula K. Le Guin's ambiguous utopias, like Anars and the Dispossessed. Sorry, I know that you don't like it, but I'm just going to talk about it for a little bit.
That's all
Um,
right.
I like it because she doesn't actually spend that much time talking about it. Like, for those of you who aren't in the know, The Dispossessed does follow the convention of the travelogue, except it's of a physicist named Shivak from a planet called Anaris that is anarchist, communal, feminist, egalitarian, and he's visiting a planet called Uras that is basically like Western society in the 70s. It's state-controlled, it's hierarchical, it's patriarchal, it's unequal, but it is lush, materially rich, and beautiful, whereas Anaris is pretty arid and its people are poor. So instead of identifying with Shivak's home society, like in traditional travel narratives, we know nothing about it. And the place where we do share a common understanding of is actually super strange to Shivak, the main character. It gives very Stranger in a Strange Land vibes, which is a sci-fi novel that was written by Robert Heinlein about 13 years prior to The Dispossessed. Although that one kind of devolves into a patriarchal, sex-obsessed mess. Would not recommend. Although it is where the word grok comes from.
Oh my God, you must be the first person on earth who's said something by Ursula K. Le Guin gives off Robert Heinlein vibes.
Well,
Wow.
I
Okay.
you can see the literary lineage.
Okay.
I
Okay.
don't
So I've only read The Dispossessed once a couple of years ago. I probably skimmed through it too fast. But weirdly, I kind of remember it being full of a lot of depressing details about the utopian society. Like no one owned property or even things. And even your kids were raised in communal nurseries and you hardly got to spend time with them. And you certainly couldn't really think of them as your own children because not being able to have belongings also extended to not being able to have possession of your own children. And it was kind of frowned upon totally selfishly choosing what work you did because if you liked it or were good at it when everyone else just toiled away at what they were told to do, it was selfish. And it sounded like a real drag of a place to live in. And it still didn't stop people being all political and bitchy and gossipy and backstabby. But maybe I'm remembering it wrong. Oh yeah, Heinlein.
know.
Stranger in a Strange Land. I also only read once, literally more than 30 years ago. So my memory of it is also sketchy. I've somehow suppressed memories of the whole sex mess aspect of it. Whereas, a few years before that, I read Heinlein's To Sail Beyond the Sunset, which sings the praises of parent child and sibling incest, so long as you're careful about the birth control, while
That's so
simultaneously
gross.
casting divorce as an evil that will totally fuck up your children. And that is somehow horribly etched in my poor brain.
Oh.
But yeah, in Stranger in a Strange Land, when they eat the main character after he's been martyred, I mean, I get the sentiment, but all I can say is that sci-fi writers must have been on a lot of drugs back then.
I mean, that's a pretty accurate assumption if you look into any of their personal lives. And your distaste for Anars, though, proves my point about how one person's utopia can really suck for another person and would be really terrible to force them to live in. Like, I think the idea of communal nurseries is a great idea and would totally be all for that. So clearly we differ on childcare ideas.
Well, I mean, it's not that I'm against communal nurseries. It feels like they took love out of the equation.
Oh, interesting. I don't feel that, but yeah, that's interesting.
I may have to read it again. I may have come away with a completely incorrect impression of the place.
I mean, I also am thinking about how it's funneled through sort of the viewpoint of Shivak, who is a very sort of clinical person. I mean, he's a scientist. He's not exactly paying attention to
Oh,
people.
that's not fair. That's not fair. Some of us are very lovey-lovey.
Yeah, I know, I know. Yeah, I was making a joke, Christina. I'm sorry. Anyway, so the reason Anaris works is that Shivak is just kind of a single guy who narrates his childhood, youth, and young adulthood, and also the main plot follows him in his interactions with the people on Urus and the cultural differences between them. So the
Oh,
guy's
I
a
remember he got tripped up by money. I remember that part.
yeah, he's like, what is going on with this? And which was really fascinating, actually. I liked his thought process about it. So that was great. But yeah, my point is that, the guy's a physicist, so he's not exactly the person to like grill about the agricultural system or the organization of labor or whether, love exists in the context of communal childcare. He probably wasn't studying up on that. So The Dispossessed is subtitled An Ambiguous Utopia, and I think that's accurate.
An ambiguous utopia, as opposed to a feminist utopia, or an ecological utopia, or a critical utopia, or
I mean, yeah, there's all sorts of types of utopia, and they all have their uses. There's the typical utopia that follows the model, and we already talked about dystopias, which tend to work, by the way, because nobody expects the oppressed proletariat to understand what the fuck is going on in the minds of their terrible overlords. They just have to react to whatever is happening. There's also something called a protopia, which I first encountered and decided, perhaps unfairly, that it was a word for people who were embarrassed to be caught out as naive for believing in the possibility of utopia, so they just made up a new word. So the word protopia is basically just the description of a society that makes incremental progress over a long period of time, thanks to the ways in which technological advancement is enhancing the natural evolutionary process. I found that quote in a New York Times article. I'll link below about it, by the way. Some people think we're already living in one.
wow, these people obviously don't read or watch the news.
Yeah, there's a lot of backsliding going on, and the
Nose
protopia.
diving, nose diving.
Well,
We're way beyond backsliding.
Protopia really seems to buy into the whole like progress myth, the idea that, like we will get better and better as time goes on, and that, like everything is always going to get better. I think the idea that protopia is upon us is a little fishy and over optimistic, certainly myopic. I mean, as far as sci-fi tropes, it's not one of them unless you want to describe, say, the past of Star Trek as protopian, because they eventually got to a point where things were utopic, sort of. Like, I don't know that you can blatantly call something
I'm
protopian.
sorry, but James Kirk does not go hand in hand with
Yeah,
Utopia.
hence why I said sort of. Uh, yeah. Um, it's the closest thing in pop culture that we get, okay? Um, But like, I don't know that you can blatantly call something protopian unless you apply it sort of retroactively. Like to me, it kind of defeats the purpose of a utopia as a dream to be achieved because you don't really think about it as sort of a future, like like a template for the future. I guess some people really like it though. Like I guess enough for like a whole New York Times article explainer on it.
So I think actually the term is way older than that New York Times article. So there is actually a blog post. There is actually a blog post from 2011 by Kevin Kelly that seems to introduce the topic. And he seems to define protopia sort of like optimism. That we should recognize, as you said, that slowly over centuries we have made progress on making life better for ourselves. And we should try to remain optimistic about our ability to solve problems and keep making that progress. And so, while I have to admit This idea sounded a whole lot better a couple of weeks ago than it does right now. And see, nosediving. And also, I think there's room for arguing that while life is better and easier for a lot of us right now as compared to, say, a few hundred years ago, it has come at enormous environmental cost.
Yeah, and I mean, like, keyword being a lot of us, like they're, like it's not like every single society on the planet is slowly incrementally getting better, right? Like it's anyways, this could be a treatise on globalization, and I will stop myself from doing that. But I just wanted to point out that that blog post is by the writer of what would eventually become the book that popularized the term protopia back in 2016, which the article references. So it all comes together.
Oh,
Uh,
just like on the A team.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they used to love it when a plan came together, right? Yeah, okay. In German, they dubbed that, they translated that as, I love it when a plan works. That is so awful.
Okay, back to Utopia. And the different types of Utopia, which I mean, like, there's also the anti-Utopia, which is a very
Oh, wait,
literary.
wait. So when that one collides with Utopia, they both explode?
I don't know if anybody's tried
Please, please.
that. I don't think that's how literary genres really work.
Oh, but wouldn't,
But
oh, imagine the world if they did, though.
would be certainly a very interesting
Well,
world.
I mean, and then if you had conferences or book fairs, wow,
Yeah, you got to be careful where you
dangerous.
put different
You'd
booths.
have to
Yeah.
license the different publishing companies to make sure no one accidentally got the utopias too close to the anti-utopias.
Uh, I mean, like the anti-utopia, though, so it deliberately mocks and points out the specific failings of the literary genre of the utopia. Like it's basically a dystopia, but it's incredibly like specifically engineered against the tropes of utopia. So like academic Gregory Clays points out that the anti-utopia's anti-collectivist nature is stressed. That it includes other themes like the dangers of science and technology, themes of social inequality, of corporate dictatorship, and nuclear war. Anti-utopias also take a psychological approach with, quote, the principle of fear being identified with despotic forms of rule carried forward from the history of political thought and group psychology, introduced as a means of understanding the relationship between utopia and dystopia, unquote. So, like, George Orwell's 1984 is a literary anti-utopia by this standard. It's not just a dystopia, it's an anti-utopia. Yeah, it uses these sort of psychological approaches to
Yeah.
really weaponizing fear.
I've either never read 1984 or I read it when I was too young to get it, and it was so long ago I don't remember. So I might as well have not
It's
read it.
horrible. It's a bad
Okay.
experience. I mean, like I recommend it as reading it because like knowing the tropes of something that is so heavily referenced in our culture, I think is a really good idea. It actually is a good thing for the imagination to kind of be in that world for a little bit, just to, experience a taste of it. But it is not a good time. I'll tell you
Okay.
that much. Yeah, but in terms of anti-utopia, I'd also add The Handmaid's Tale in there, since it fits the standard of deliberately addressing themes like the state of fear and group psychology and nuclear war, etc., etc. Atwood has a reputation for writing literary dystopias with sort of a hint of utopia, and she actually addresses that and coins the word ustopia. She says that each contains a latent version of the other. So within each utopia, there is a latent dystopia, and within each dystopia, there's a latent utopia, which I totally agree with. And it's another pointy literary term, I think. It's meant to highlight utopian stories containing dystopia within them. So, which to you and me is really obvious, but I guess Atwood decided that there needed to be this specific word, ustopia, to describe that phenomenon in case people automatically dismiss the idea of utopia as naive or something.
Yeah, people do have strong feelings about utopia, don't they? And strong feelings about the people who dream of them. But I think you're right that she's right. Although I'm not really, I'm like you, I'm not really sure we need a separate term for this. Dystopian stories generally do have flickers of utopia in them, in visions of the way the upper classes live, or in the ways the oppressed people team up and also look after each other, or even in memories of the past before the fall. I mean, you have to have some glimmers of hope and visions of what people are fighting for, otherwise, it's just grimdark torture porn. Plus, the best way for a writer to make a dystopia look horrific is against the occasional glitter of how great things could be if it wasn't for the jerk faces in power.
Yeah, you gotta have a little light to illuminate the darkness, right?
Yeah, but I'm stumbling over the other way around. Why does Utopia have to have tarnishes of dystopia peeking out from under the rugs and behind the sofas? I mean, we all live, we don't, none of us lives in a utopia. So, I mean, we just have life for to compare and contrast. And I know you keep trying to tell me why, but I'm still like, no,
Mm.
it doesn't need to be this way. Sometimes things can just be good.
Hmm. I, hmm. I'll let you go.
Yeah, but one thing this duality is making me think of is the book My Real Children by Joe Walton. I don't know if you've read this one.
No, I haven't.
Okay, it's a literary sci-fi and alternate history novel where
Huh.
the protagonist is an old lady with dueling sets of memories. So it's like, the implication here is that she has some sort of dementia. And
Okay.
and so the book tells the story of her two lifelines. Okay, and one of them, she refuses to run off and get married with a guy who will then turn out to be a closeted gay man whose self-hatred causes him to treat other people really badly.
Hmm.
Instead, she turns him down and she has a successful career, partners up with an incredible woman, and they have a beautiful family together. Against the backdrop of the world falling into pretty serious dystopia with nuclear warfare, prosecution of gays, repression of women, that sort of thing. In the other lifeline, the protagonist runs off with the guy who will turn out to be a closeted gay man. She becomes a housewife in an oppressive, violent marriage,
Ugh.
spawns a slew of hateful children, and only comes into her own and only briefly experiences love in late middle age. But this life unfolds against the backdrop of the blossoming of utopia on Earth. And the protagonist comes to realize that although Joel Walton hates stories where the fate of the world hinges upon the choices of a single character, the character realizes she has to pick one of these lifelines. The
Huh.
fate of the world rests on her saying yes or no to eloping with the guy who will turn out to be a monster. Right? So, which one is she going to choose? The wonderful personal life and the amazing family in the dystopia, or the wretched personal life and the shitty offspring in utopia?
Do
So,
we know, like, so sorry to interrupt, but
it's all right.
I'm kind of confused because, like, okay, this is narrated by an older woman, and so that implies that a choice already has been made.
No, she hasn't made it yet. She makes it
Oh.
at the end of the book.
Oh.
You don't realize until very, very late in the book that which of the two lives that she remembers she chooses to hang on to determines the fate of the world. So whether it develops into a utopia or into a dystopia.
Oh, okay. I clearly need to read the book so that I understand
Yeah,
it better.
Joe.
But
Well, it's a nice book. And she has a couple nice books.
hmm.
But anyway, so even here, the good cannot exist without the bad, and vice versa. So the dystopian personal life and the utopia and the utopian personal life and the dystopia are kind of staring at each other like four sets of mirrors. um, and even though I really enjoyed this book and it made me a fan of Joe Walton, I am still like, why can't sometimes things just be good?
Huh. I'm starting to wonder if you're having a problem with the way that plots and tension are traditionally constructed and created in fiction. Without a kernel of grit, there's no pearl, and without conflict, there's no interesting story. And that doesn't really translate to real life. But as we discussed in an earlier episode, it's really not necessary for the stakes of the conflict in fiction to be so darn high.
Christina breaking in to say, I'm not sure if that was an earlier episode or if that was a panel discussion we had at the Solarpunk conference in 2024. I think it was the Solarpunk conference, though.
So honestly, Christina, I'm not sure that I can adequately answer your question, except to just observe that conflict and contrariness are part of the human condition and that writers play that up. So in order to believe in utopia, you have to have faith, I guess, that things can just be good with no catch. But then we're getting into the realm of religion.
Well, gosh, even Eden needed its people to be naive sheeple, right? The authoritarian nanny state tossed them out the minute they started thinking for themselves, the minute they started questioning anything. So, I don't know if maybe that's at the core of our lack of imagination here. Maybe this trope, irritating to me at least, that utopia can only exist in the form of sheeple in a docile flock, guided and protected by a mighty shepherd. It goes back at least 5,000 years, actually, not just to Sir Thomas, depending on exactly how ancient the Genesis part of the Torah or Old Testament are.
Mm.
So maybe that's the origin of that. But I'm not saying there needs to be no conflict, nor that people need to be perfect. We've talked a lot about interesting types of conflict that you could have in solarpunk stories, even one set in a lovely solarpunk future. What I'm begging for is a utopia that isn't authoritarian, or that people don't have to be sheeple in, or that doesn't strip everyone of their individuality, or that doesn't stand on the backs of slaves or an underclass, or that doesn't have to have some other seriously dystopian bricks built into it. Why can't we explore what it would be like to live in a reasonable utopia? But I don't get why utopia can't be something fair, unoppressive, sustainable, and nourishing that people make for themselves, rather than being something people have to be straitjacketed into and policed by Big Brother to prevent them from doing any utopian behavior. So maybe let me put it this way. Please, can you give me a good example of some good uplifting writing in a utopian setting? Like I'm trying to figure out if Woman on the Edge of Time by Marge Piercy counts. But yeah,
Mm.
I haven't read that one within the last 35 years either. Although
Mm.
I kind of also remember that it has some pretty serious visions of a future dystopia as well as a future utopia.
Yeah, I haven't read that one in a while either, so I'm not sure how well it would actually hold up. I mean, I gotta say that a lot of the utopian books that I encountered when I was younger don't actually hold up. A lot of feminist utopias, like Herland and The Shattered Chain and The City of Women, which depict a female separatist society, like they're actually pretty trans exclusive, surprise, surprise. And the eco-utopias can be pretty colonial and white saviory. Here's one that I'm currently a fan of, though, which is a short story. It's called Kitaskina 2350 by Chelsea Vowell. Here's the plot. It's been 300 years since an event called the Great Truth Telling, after which 6,000 people from Earth left to go live on Mars, and they sealed themselves away there in basically kind of a 21st century style of living. At the time of the story, there are some people from Mars who want to come back to Earth. They're called the returners, and they want to make their home there again. And the main character is a 15-year-old knowledge keeper in training.
And she lives on Earth where they're like, oh my gosh, what are these returners going to be like?
That the elders have chosen to go back in time to the 21st century to go bear witness to the way that the 21st century humans interacted, specifically the interaction between settlers and indigenous peoples, so that they can sort of understand the returners' mindsets and sort of what they expect and where they're coming from and how to relate to them best. Basically, in this story, the future is indigenous, is specifically a Cree-Métis vision of the future, and the relationships are just so fascinating. It's in an anthology called This Place, 150 Years Retold, and the radio dramatization of the story is available from the CBC. So I'll put the link in the comments. It's just so radically different from anything that I've ever encountered before. It, again, is extremely sparse on the details, but from reading the story, you get a sense of the really close-knit relationships and respect and the way that, I mean, this girl is 15 years old and she's respected and like given this very important mission to go back. I'm wondering if I'm using the wrong pronoun there. Perhaps the main character is non-binary. Can't remember.
Christina breaking in here to say that I just checked and the character is a she. So Ariel means well, but she's about to make the wrong decision here.
Regardless, they're just really trusted by the adults. And so the fact that they're a child isn't held against them. It's actually a point in their favor because they're learning and growing and they don't have a lot of the knowledge of human prejudices and anticipation of violence maybe that older people might have. So yeah, it's cool. I'm also a huge fan of how Wakanda and Talocan were portrayed in the Black Panther 1 and 2 movies.
Embarrassingly, I have not seen either of these.
Oh,
I'm not really a superhero movie person.
I want to say that while those two societies in the films are utopias, they both have a ton of faults to them. So, like, I'm not actually sure that they really count. But all the fictional utopias, like ecological utopias, feminist utopias, Marxist utopias, you name it, they're all utopias for a specific identity. And so are these ones. They're uplifting for people who value the same things as those societies. And I totally acknowledge that if you look too close at the details, they really start to fall apart. Like I said, I like stories that are about characters and their relationships, and the utopia as a background is a bonus. And so while these aren't my ideal utopias, I don't think that could ever be represented in fiction unless I wrote it myself, but these ones are pretty close. Like the melding of advanced technology as well as traditional knowledge and integration of nature and humanity and respect for others, at least within their home society. If we're talking about the Talo Canil, they think they're better than everybody else. And magical realism or weaving in and out of what Western imaginations think is real and what isn't. Like that's all kind of my jam. Like I really enjoy that. That really tickles my imagination. And I don't think it's a coincidence that these utopias that I like specifically are represented in a graphic novel that turned into a radio play aimed at teens and a blockbuster movie and its sequel. Like, it's obvious that the writers of these narratives thought a lot about utopia and the related academic theory behind the themes of these stories and the history of utopia and how it's been represented in fiction. But for the most part, none of that is actually explicitly stated or shown in any way in like the actual story. If utopias are obvious, they aren't enjoyable to me. Like, I don't want to have to think about utopia. Like, I don't want to be presented with it. I want to live utopia.
Oh, okay. I put that a bumper sticker on our electric car. But it would probably be more fitting on a bicycle.
As a sign over the basket at the front, maybe? Yeah. Oh, I forgot to mention that I'd also include the Ghibli films Kiki's Delivery Service, Howl's Moving Castle, and Castle in the Sky as utopias that I like. Like, again, we only see a child's view of like a small slice of society or even just a singular way of life, so there's not really a way to accurately describe the entire setting as utopic. But oh man, are the vibes just immaculate in those films. Like the aesthetics and the values and the ethos of utopian humanism are really, really present. Honestly, they even surface for me in Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind, Princess Mononoke, and Spirited Away, although they're only in certain scenes and depicting like background characters and settings. So I don't really think that those ones count.
Yeah, so I have not seen those first three movies. So maybe this is the lead I need for a positive vision of utopia, untrammeled by an enslaved or unpressed underclass, simple sheeple being minded by the authoritarian nanny state or other dystopian elements.
I think you'd take issue with the actual governance as represented in the film's wider worlds, but to the protagonists, the world they live in is fundamentally a good one, and that feeling really comes through. Like they might be kids who don't have a good grasp on the broader implications of some character actions, but the way that they live in the world and interact with it is as if it were a utopia. And so they kind of create a utopian like field around them through their actions, which is sort of a weird way to put it, I guess.
I'm not sure if innocent children are going to clear my no naive sheeple hurdle. Guess I'll have to watch and see.
I guess you will. So, on that note, thank you, listeners, for listening and bearing with us through this discussion. It's clearly something that we are going to return to in later episodes. But we hope that this gave you some food for thought. And if you'd like to, please tell us about your favorite utopias.
Yeah, maybe to liven my spirits on this issue here.
So drop us a comment on our website, Patreon, our YouTube channel, or come connect with us on Mastodon.
Until next episode.
Stay Solarpunk.
Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel Kroon and Christina de la Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
Don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents.
Every little bit helps us keep bringing you discussions and interviews.
Until the next episode, keep dreaming.
And stay Solarpunk.